for joining us on Fascism on Film. I'm James Kent. Along with me is Till Minton. And again, if you're finding us, you may have found us on fascismonfilm.com. You may have found us on Apple Podcasts or Podbean, Spotify, or any other of these podcast outlets. But thank you for tuning in. And we are very deep into our first season. And today we are going to discuss the movie, the 1942 film, To Be or Not to Be by Ernst Lubitsch, a very famous filmmaker, regarded as one of the great sort of screwball comedy directors of all time.
Known for the Lubitsch touch.
Yes.
Which is a way of sort of putting in ellipses in the script and having the audience fill them in. It was a very light touch to the storytelling.
And what's interesting about him, and again, we could go into a whole history about this guy, but the movies that he was making were through the code, the Hollywood production code, the Hays Code, but there were sort of two phases where you could get away with some stuff, and then you could slowly, it started getting harder and harder. And with Lubitsch, was so clever at the innuendos that he was able to get through even as things got tighter and tighter, because the censors were like, oh, well, you know what? He's listening to us. He's doing stuff in a sophisticated way, and we think that the audiences will either not get it or will be okay. He's skirting a line and he's all right.
Yeah.
And he kept finding new nuanced ways as the code got stricter and stricter. How he got through some of the things in this movie is kind of a head scratcher.
Kind of a mystery. Yeah.
And it caused a lot of controversy because critics weren't kind to aspects. And then over the years, this is one of those films where it was not well received when it first came out. However, it's been regarded as a film masterpiece. BFI had it on their either top 100.
100, yeah. It's on all sorts of lists as being a classic at this point.
One of the other things is, again, the way that Hollywood worked and assigned roles, and he was a director. He wasn't the screenwriter of record on this movie, To Be or Not to Be.
Yeah.
However, as historians have said, that the writers of the screenplay and the story, this guy Edwin Justice Mayer, and then the story by Melchior Langel, who was a Hungarian, essentially they were mere stenographers for Lubitsch. He would put all this stuff in, and they didn't really have much. And everybody in Hollywood knew that. And so he was very instrumental, even though he never took credit.
Okay, because what I was reading
okay.
from a different film scholar than the one you were reading, apparently, was that this writer actually had quite a lot to do with it. And if you look at his work as a playwright, you see a lot of that come across in this film. And of course, he did work very closely with Lubitsch, but it's been argued that he actually did have a lot to do with the script.
Yeah, there's Lubitsch's idea, and then he, got the story shaped. But Lubitsch was always he was a very hands-on guy. So who wrote what? Like some of these great, insane lines in the movie? I don't know.
I do know this, that Lubitsch would not change the script. He figured once the script was done, the movie was done. And then all you do is photograph it, but you don't change any lines, you don't do any improv, you don't add scenes. You just shoot the script exactly the way it is, and you just do 2 or 3 takes on everything, except for that one scene when he did 35 takes.
There's a scene in the movie that he does 35 takes?
Yes. It's on, it's when, what's his name, the actor, Joseph, wakes up the young
Jack
soldier.
Benny?
Yeah, Jack Benny. When Jack Benny wakes up the guy who's sleeping in his bed.
Yeah, Robert Stack.
Yeah, when he wakes up Robert Stack, that scene they did 35 takes on.
Fascinating.
Yeah, because he wanted a specific look on Jack Benny's face, and so they just did that over and over again. But
now, I know like this has been already different than a lot of the other episodes that we've tackled here, because we're talking about fascism on film here, and this film is a fantasy, I guess, if you will. It's about a theater troupe in Poland at the outbreak of World War II, and things were already getting very adversarial between Germany and Poland, and when we are launched into the beginning of this film, at first, you think that you're watching a film about Nazis, and you see actors that you might have been found famous. Like you see suddenly Jack Benny in some kind of Nazi commander's outfit, and you're like, what's going on here? And supposedly that was the rumor that when Jack Benny's father came to see the film,
Yes.
he saw his son dressed as a Nazi to start the movie and walked right out. And then
and they
he
had
had to get him back in.
They convinced him. Yeah.
And then he eventually loved it. But there's an interesting thing through my research and reading is that throughout the film, this film about doubles and pretending and performing as one thing, you are always introduced to you're introduced to like real people and fake people before you get to the other people.
Yeah.
And so that you're constantly sort of adjusting to the idea of masquerade.
Exactly. Yes. And I think, just to finish off what you were saying is that it's about this theater troupe in Poland, and then and they're planning on putting on an anti-Nazi play, and that's what we
called
see
Gestapo.
at the beginning. Called Gestapo. And so they have these two competing productions, Gestapo and Hamlet are their two. And then the war starts and everything changes, right? Of course they can't put on the play now. And they're occupied and all this stuff, and they lose their theater troupe. So it's and then the story is so complicated in the screwball comedy tradition that there's the actors are pretending to be Nazis. They're pretending to be different characters. They're using their stage set as a pretend Nazi headquarters to fool people. By the end of the movie, they are dressed up as Hitler and pretending to be Hitler, and they steal Hitler's plane and fly it to England. I mean, it's really kind of over the top and ridiculous. But as you said, it's all about that idea of performance. And is fascism really just a performance, or the performance of power in a way? And so are these Nazis performing in the same way that the actors are performing when pretending to be Nazis? And are the actors giving up a better performance as Hitler than Hitler himself gives? Those sorts of questions start to come in. And it's doing all this in this screwball comedy way, which is filled with all these reveals and misunderstandings and situational comedic things. It really gets us thinking about all this stuff, but at the same time is hilarious.
And then there's these interesting aspects, because this is 1942. This comes out in March of 42. So, war, we haven't, the Allied forces haven't invaded Europe yet, but we're knee deep into the war. And Poland fell, right? It fell in 10 days, 30 days?
Yeah.
I can't remember what it was. So the history that they're talking about, this is a fantasy in that it's imagining that Poland has even a chance when they already know when they're making this movie that Poland fell pretty quick.
Yeah.
And so it's almost using this opportunity to give the Poles a chance to strike back at Germany, right?
Yeah.
And say all the things that they can't. And what America really understood or knew about what was going on with the Jewish population in Poland, I think that this is what makes the film controversial, even when people watch it today, is that it makes fun of a lot of subjects that you feel are forgotten today.
There are a few lines of dialogue which were incredibly controversial at the time.
The film is this blend of mostly screwball comedy, but then even within scene to scene, there are some pretty serious stuff, because the subject matter, a country invading another country and what happens to this country, that's pretty serious stuff. And the music can switch from light to dark. Another thing that's really fascinating is the cinematography. And this is like a comedy, so you'd expect in usual cases, everything's high-key lighting or something, but the film was shot by a Scandinavian master, Rudolf Maté, who shot Dreyer's Vampire and also shot Joan of Arc. And this guy was well known as establishing the three-point lighting system.
Yes.
And if you break down, he utilizes the three-point lighting system in a high-key and low-key methods in order to change the mood, sometimes with even in the scenes from scene to scene, whether or not the film is to show comedy or it's to show seriousness. And there's a scene where there's this, the whole concept lies on a professor who's actually a Nazi agent. Then the RAF, the British, find out about it, and they're trying to get word to Poland to stop this guy from, giving them all sorts of information, the Nazis. So that's where we get a lot of these doublings. But there's a scene where you had mentioned that the theater troupe has redefine their theater to look like it's Gestapo headquarters.
Yeah.
And they bring in this professor. And when the professor is talking to Jack Benny in the auditorium, it's got the lighting of a comedy. But then when Jack Benny has to go back, he has to go into he says, I have to go to the other room and, check on this in headquarters.
He goes to talk to all the other actors.
And the other actors, suddenly it looks like a film noir. Because they're talking about serious stuff. And this movie will switch tones, and it's there to guide an audience who's unaware that they're being manipulated. And that's what makes this film so genius, is that you don't even realize it's doing this.
So I have a quote from Lubitsch, which addresses this directly. He says, I was tired of the two established recognized recipes, drama with comedy relief and comedy with dramatic relief. I made up my mind to make a picture with no attempt to relieve anybody from anything at any time. Dramatic when the situation demands it, satire and comedy when it's called for. One might call it a tragical farce or a farcical tragedy. I do not care, and neither do the audience.
Interesting.
So he's very aware that he's blending these tones, these styles of cinematography, and making a film that is at times a film noir and at times a screwball comedy. And he manages this high wire act incredibly well, because the film, there's not a point at which I feel like I'm taken out of the film.
Oh, yeah. No, it's a perfect, it's brilliant direction.
Yeah.
So throughout the movie in the first half, if you're looking carefully at a lot of these second unit things that they show about the city as Poland is like getting, kind of annihilated by the Germans, etc., you're seeing a lot of signs, warning signs in the Gestapo. And there's a lot of warnings, very sinister, about this Captain Earhart.
Yes. Colonel, I think.
You're building up that this guy is like the most ruthless, evil dude you've ever could come across. And, eventually we're going to get to Colonel Earhart. And it turns out when you meet this guy, he is the most bumbling. You'd said something, about like when we talked about Amarcord, how Fellini viewed fascists. And this guy in reality is just a buffoon. And he loves his reputation, which is, what's the line that Jack Benny used?
He's known as Concentration Camp Earhart, which is something that he really likes. He likes that moniker.
Yeah, he says that we do the concentrating and the Poles do the camping.
Yeah, so that line, there's two lines in this movie. That's one of them. We do the concentrating and the Poles do the camping. I showed this line, just a screenshot of this line to my daughter, and she was like, that's offensive.
Well, yeah.
She's like, and I was like, this was made in 1942. Like, how do you think they thought of it then? Like, and it was a very controversial line, but Lubitsch refused to cut any line. The other line, of course, is, I think it's also Colonel Earhart is talking to Jack Benny, and Jack Benny said, oh, well, surely you've heard of this famous Polish actor.
Which is it's him.
Which is him. And the Nazi said, or Colonel Earhart says, oh, yes, I saw him do Hamlet once. He did to Shakespeare what we're doing to Poland.
Hearing it even today, I was just like, how did they say that in 1942? How did they say that?
And it's such a brilliant joke. I thought about it a lot because it asks the audience to provide the verb.
Yes.
And so whatever we put in there is worse than what he could have put in there, right? What we're doing to Poland, well, we could be screwing Poland, we could be destroying Poland, we could be liberating and saving Poland in this guy's mind. But it asks the audience to do that, and so we are complicit in the joke.
Well, that's another thing that Lubitsch is trying to do through the entire film. He's making the audience complicit in everything.
In everything.
Because there's another aspect, and I guess it's an aspect, I'm not a scholar on screwball comedies, but screwball comedies always revolve around a love triangle. But in this film, and this is another fascinating thing, the way this triangle's handled is that Carole Lombard, who she passed away tragically in a plane crash right before this movie came out.
Yeah.
And she is a genius, a brilliant comic actress in this film.
Brilliant comic actress,
and the characters as they're set up at the beginning, she's the main actress of the troupe, and Jack Benny is her husband. They seem like they're a bit of a mismatch. And people in 1942 would go into the movie with an understanding and expectation of who both Benny, who was a massive radio star, and who Carole Lombard were. They like brought their sort of A-list star game to it. So they are playing characterizations of themselves who are playing characterizations of their characters. It's crazy, but they're two shallow people who are so into themselves that they don't even seem to really have a marriage that works. And so
they don't.
seems to fall for this like young flyer, and they go off and sort of have an affair, and it's done with such this cavalier attitude that I've never really seen handled in a movie like this before, that you're wondering, how did this pass in 1942?
Exactly. A lot of their quote-unquote affair takes place off-screen, and so we're not really confronted with it. And that, again, is that Lubitsch touch of putting in those ellipses and having us fill in. And in this case, we're sort of filling in the affair because there are scenes that are mentioned that we don't see.
But there's a line that Carole Lombard says that is more genius than anything I would ever see in a movie that can just say it. But and it implies so much, especially the way she delivers it. But she says to Robert Stack, who's the flyer, who's enamored with her, who she seems to be having an affair with, she says, "It's the first time I've met a man who can drop 3 tons of dynamite in under 2 minutes." Like that, like you're sitting there going, how did that? That's
How
like
did
can
they
mean
get away
nothing
with
else
that?
other than what it sounds like it means.
Yeah, and it is exactly what it sounds like it means. I think. I don't. I mean, you have to fill in some things. So something you were saying a little bit ago, I think, is really important, which is about how, and this was controversial at the time, is how this Colonel Ehrhardt is depicted as being sort of this bumbling idiot. And there's a real question in this film and sort of all films about Nazis is how you portray them. Are they menacing and evil? I had another quote from Lubitsch where he basically said that the movies that portray them as highly competent and evil almost get us to admire them a little bit because they're so good at what they do. And so this idea of putting them in farce and making them look like an incompetent, blowhard joke like Colonel Ehrhardt, is that good resistance? Does that actually diminish their power, or does it distract from their power? And that's the conversation that was going on at the time about this film, about whether Nazis should be depicted as fools or as competent. And I would say this debate is still going on.
I mean, this movie, you could probably talk about it for hours, and we're not going to get everything probably in this episode that we could talk about, which is why I think this is such a fascinating movie about fascism or just World War II or whatever. There's things that are so fascinating where Jack Benny, who's supposed to be a theater actor, right? And he's not a very good one, but now see these people who are very shallow. I mean, at the beginning of the movie, when they're going to be putting on this play, a Gestapo, the first time we meet Carole Lombard, she comes in and she is like in this beautiful dress, which apparently was designed by her personal designer who did stuff to stars. Her name was Irene, and it was in her contract that I must have these beautiful outfits from Irene. She comes in the most gorgeous thing, and she's supposed to be a concentration camp victim. And she's like, oh, but I think it would be such a brilliant contrast of the decay. And it's like, she is so shallow and doesn't understand.
Yes.
But through what happens in the movie, these characters who seem like that they really just were living these lives really just focused on themselves and being theater actors, they have to find themselves giving it up their whatever for their country, right? They have to become heroes, and they're not heroes, but that's what they do. And they take this suddenly very seriously. And basically Jack Benny and Carole Lombard put aside whatever their marital issues are so that they can work with the third person in the triangle, Robert Stack, for the greater good.
Yes.
Which is to foil the Nazis if they can so that more people won't die.
Yeah, and so and they all escape basically,
except for one guy.
Except for one guy
who actually has to make the big sacrifice. The guy who never gets to play the big part.
He never gets to play Shylock, and he wants to, and he does little parts of Shylock's monologue throughout the film, and finally, at the end, he gets to do the monologue for real for the Nazis.
Yes, and his distraction is what helps them escape.
And what's interesting is that he's been performing it all before, and this time it's not really a performance. He actually means it when he's talking to the Nazis about, if you prick us, do we not bleed? And so what's a performance and what's real is really a question that starts to get asked here. And, like Jack Benny at the end, this is what I want to say, is that Lubitsch said to Jack Benny, you're not a comedian, you're not even a clown, you're an actor playing a comedian, and that's why I want you for this part.
Yeah, I mean, Jack Benny was very excited. I think it was, it was the only time that he really got to be what he thought as an actor in a movie.
Yeah.
Another thing, again, these are little things that happen in the movie, but it just shows you already as history was happening, it remembered. There's a scene where the one actor in the troupe actually looks a lot like Hitler, and he ended up playing Hitler in a lot of movies, apparently. When he has to jump out the plane, he lands on this pile of hay, and he comes up, and the people who see him, they go, oh my, first it was Hess, now him. And of course, Hess was a guy who bailed out on the Nazis and thought he could make a deal to save himself. Instead, he was immediately put in prison. So it was genius, the idea that they were saying that when it came to push to shove, they're like, oh yeah, Hitler's bailing out on the Nazis too.
Exactly. Yeah. And to use Hitler as a punchline like that, I think a lot of people found really in poor taste, and that it borders on playing down the threat of Nazism. I find it funny.
See, and this is why they thought they could make this movie. 2 years ago, The Great Dictator was number 4 at the box office, and everybody loved The Tramp and that he looked at. And so that was there. But I think that's because ultimately, the Tramp was an innocent, and he was making a point about humanity. And for whatever reason, this film rubbed people initially the wrong way. But it's really, to me, as I've now seen this movie several times, I think that this is one of the most genius screenplays.
Oh, the screenplay is just absolutely, it's just a masterful piece of clockwork design. Every line of dialogue moves the story forward. The scenes sort of fold back in on each other and reflect each other. And it's so tight. It just, like I said, it's just like a piece of clockwork. It's just a beautifully constructed story.
They have this professor, right? It's a fake. But then at some point, Jack Benny has to be the professor because they've killed the professor.
They kill the professor.
And so he shows up, but yet when they make Jack Benny up to look like the professor, it's like you can't tell the difference.
You can't tell the difference. My first time watching this, I was like, wait, who's who in a couple of scenes?
It's amazing. And then what the most genius scene is that at some point, the dead professor is discovered by the Nazis. Yes. So then Captain Earhart and them all know, and so they know Jack Benny's coming back as the professor, and they know that he's got to be a fraud. And
he's an imposter.
They decide rather than just kill him, they decide to toy with him a little bit and torture him. So they say, well, go wait in the next room. And when Jack Benny gets in there, the dead professor is set up in the room. And how Jack Benny gets out of it is so genius.
He ends up convincing them that the dead guy is the imposter and he's the real guy.
Yeah, and it's shows again how the Nazis are so stupid. But then the other Nazis come in and they expose Benny for being a fraud, which was the plan all along to take him away. And it turns out it's his own acting troupe. And if he had not come in, he would have convinced them still. And it's so crazy.
And so it is that question, about Nazism as a performance, right? They wear these uniforms, these costumes. There's a scene where a guy is practicing saying Heil Hitler in the mirror. There's also this thing about this joke about a cheese being named after Hitler.
Yeah.
So when Colonel Earhart makes the joke, suddenly he's afraid that the professor might turn him into Hitler for making the joke. And so there's this idea that the Nazis are performing for each other also, that the whole thing is kind of a stage setup.
Right. They're really cowards. And
Yes.
they, they're afraid of each other. And that's a lot of things that happen in the movies, that they're like, afraid of stepping out of the order.
Yeah, they're afraid of each other. And so they are also all, well, and like Colonel Earhart is playing a role of this concentration camp guy. That's the reason he likes that, is because it makes him look menacing, when in reality, he's just a nincompoop and kind of incompetent.
Again, when we look at fascism, when people sign up for this, Earhart at some point is trying to woo Carole Lombard. He's pretty much offering of how, like, hey, you could be a spy for us, and if you do, we can make it really attractive for you. Like, basically, hey, come along with the winning side. And it even talks about that like, that being a winner is more important. And that's where, when I look at any of these films, I want to look at, can I make some comparisons today? And I see a lot of that same attitude of like, whether or not this policy is actually good for America, well, just be on the winning side and everything's going to be good for you. Don't worry about these other schmoes. I mean, we'll give you a bonus to sign up for our fascist hit squad. Just please.
That scene is hilarious too, because he offers her some things. He's like, do you want a bracelet? I just confiscated a nice one today. And then he says, I'll give you extra butter rations and 3 eggs a week if you'll become a Nazi spy. And
and she says she'll have to think about it. She's like, I have to see if that, like, something about her conscience. And it's really funny. Like, see if she can basically like all this is good. All she has to do is like, forget that she has a conscience, basically. And it's like these little digs is like, it's getting a chance to say why fascism is bad without like hammering it in a non-subtle way. And that's what I really like about this film.
Yeah.
There's a thing about how a few years before, Lubitsch had one of his biggest successes with this movie, The Shop Around the Corner, which people who have not seen that movie might be surprised to know that it was remade years later with Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan into You've Got Mail.
Yep.
And I've seen Little Shop Around the Corner, but it's been years. And it takes place in like a little Polish town or something. So what Lubitsch did, because it's only, remember, this is a 1942 audience, and it's only a couple years after this movie, he does these establishing shots of this little Polish town. And while it's not supposed to be exactly the little shop around the corner town, he mirrors those exact shots and sets to try to look so that an audience can feel familiar with this Polish and identify with these people and sympathize with them. And again, these are like very, very nuanced filmmaking tricks that I am impressed when I hear these things and see it unfold, that these kind of things, I don't know if they go on as much in a movie today.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, I think they do if you look at the right directors. But, Lubitsch is one of the all-time great directors. And there are people that are working at that level, I think.
After seeing some pretty serious movies, it's nice to maybe take a break. And again, there's some serious subject matter here, for sure.
I have a little trivia piece for you.
Oh, great. Why don't you hit me with that? But I'm just saying I was enjoying seeing a comedy for once.
Yeah. So the producer of this film,
Korda,
Alexander Korda, yes, he was in England as the war was going on, and he's an American, but he was sent to America with a bunch of money by the British to make some movies. And the first thing he made was To Be or Not to Be. And so there's this slight little conspiracy theory that maybe the British government was involved in this film to get the U.S. on board with the war sooner.
Yeah, because that's how The Archers kind of became big. Yes. Because if you know that Korda also produced some of those films, and like Thief of Baghdad, for instance, and Archers were designed of like those kind of why we fight without being a documentary series, but the idea of like what we're fighting for, like, and basically the spirit of England. We should survive. We thrive. We don't want that destroyed through Nazism. And so, that makes sense. There's movies that were designed to sympathize, because we had declared war after the Japanese, bomb Pearl Harbor. So that was like the end of 41. So that means To Be or Not to Be was in production before we actually declared war. So,
It was in production, but so there is a propagandistic aspect to it, which is get us to sympathize and see as Americans, to have American actors in those roles, but to get us to empathize with those characters. There's one more line from the film that I want to point out that I think is important. Initially, they're doing that Gestapo play, and it's canceled because the government doesn't want to upset the Nazis anymore. So they cancel the Gestapo play, and then the next day, the Nazis invade Poland, and the theater troupe, I forget who says it exactly, says, "We don't have to worry about the Nazi play anymore. The Nazis are putting on the show now, a much bigger one, and there's no censor to stop them." And this idea that that the invasion of Poland is the big show, and that they are sort of taking over all culture, right? And just canceling out all these things. And there isn't anyone to stop them. There is no censor saying there's no adult in the room, right? It's just the Nazis coming in and putting on this giant show of war and fascism and theatricality and uniforms and Heil Hitlers. We've talked about this a lot before, that, and I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, that fascism is about a performance of power. So just taking something over and shutting it down or something like that, or, canceling the theater production, whatever it is, just the act of doing that is performing that power, is exercising that power. And so it's less important what the outcome is or what the consequences are. What's important is the action. And fascism continually just focuses on action for the sake of action, and the consequences be damned. And we see this in films like Amarcord, right, where it's sort of part of the society, part of the fabric, and it doesn't really become this radicalized thing immediately. And so it is just about acting on that power and getting people to comply with it. And if people comply in advance, all the better for the Nazis.
Yeah, and one of the biggest differences between today and a movie like To Be or Not to Be, and some of the other films that we talked about with like Confessions of a Nazi Spy, The Black Legion, the message from the media and the filmmakers and artists was, this fascism, here's what it is, and it's bad, and it's not American, and we don't want it. And yet today, it's, well, I'm not seeing those messages out there. Individually, yes, but I mean, I'm not seeing any big organization or anything taking a stand of saying, hey, America.
Hollywood made around 150 anti-Nazi films, To Be or Not to Be included in that. And that was, and that was in just a few years. Like in maybe 6 years, they made 150 anti-Nazi films. And we're not seeing that kind of resistance going on now, and for a lot of different reasons. But, if you look at the resistance that was going on in German cinema in the mid-30s, I think you'll see that there actually wasn't very much resistance going on.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, that was a joke, but... So anyhow, I highly recommend To Be or Not to Be. I think it really gets at a lot of these fundamental questions. It does it in an interesting and fun way, and gets us really thinking about how we perceive fascist and what we would do if confronted. If somebody says, we have ways of making you talk or whatever, what do we do in those situations? Can we improv our way out of them the way Jack Benny does, or are we stuck? That's sort of the fantasy of this film, is that you can perform your way out of fascism. Performance is a type of dissent and resistance, and that's a way in which we can overcome this is through performance, basically.
Keep in mind when you'd mentioned your daughter found things offensive. Look, the jokes that they make with concentration camps, we got to keep in mind this is 1942, and obviously concentration camps were known as a bad thing where people were sent. But they did not have the knowledge of what was to then become, and now you hear concentration camps, it's completely synonymous with the Holocaust. So much so that you can't say concentration. You want to label something today as a concentration camp, there's going to be a pile of people that are going to say, how dare you?
Yeah.
So that's what makes this film controversial. You have to put it in that perspective of 1942. Absolutely. And then if you can, I think you can jive with this movie.
But even still, it was controversial in 1942. A lot of people were really upset about this film.
They were, but the most that they were upset about was that particular line about what he did to Shakespeare.
He did to Shakespeare what we're doing to Poland.
Yeah, that line, so the most influential film critic of the time was the New York Times film critic Bosley Crowther, and he went off on this film. And it's just, these are ridiculous, but it's funny that film critics were by and large not only very conservative, but they towed the line with the Hays Code.
And all of Lubitsch's friends told him to cut that line. Like Billy Wilder told him to cut the line. And Lubitsch, everyone told him to cut it, and he absolutely refused.
Well, he had a sense of history then, because it's one of, I think, to me, as I realized, it's one of the most brilliant lines in film cinema.
Absolutely, yeah. And definitely in this fascism wheelhouse we're in.
But I also think that's, again, when I look at the brilliance of screenwriting back then, I'm not like saying we should go back to the code,
right?
But I think the art of screenwriting and how you conveyed things when you couldn't just say it.
Yes.
It really, like, you couldn't write the way that they wrote that. Like, try it now would be so hard. And it's such a great treat to see a film like this with the way that the dialogue is. So anyways, listener out there, and if you've been enjoying the series and if you've listened to all of our episodes, we are almost at the end of our first season. And that doesn't mean, see us next year. We're going to be back at maybe only...
No. We'll just take a few weeks off.
Exactly. Just to like regroup and get the next set going. But I think that this sort of like launches us into sort of like early looks at fascism. We're going to probably move forward a little bit. But we got one more episode that will come out, and we're going to keep this as a little bit of surprise. It's not necessarily in keeping with the other episodes so far. Thematically, it's a little different, but we've already had kind of a request from someone who's listened to the podcast and probably wondering why we haven't done that. And we probably wouldn't be doing this particular movie for a few seasons now. So I think that maybe one of the things that we'll do at the end of a season is maybe pick a film.
Throw in a little surprise film.
Yeah, maybe it's a little bit more pop culture-y or a different genre, but it's still very fascist. And as a matter of fact, this movie may be a
Don't
film
oversell it.
Well, no, but it probably has a comment on fascism that's very strong, I think. So we'll do that next time. Again, thanks for listening to Fascism on Film, and the website is fascismonfilm.com.
Thanks for listening.
All right. Bye now.